In June 1978, 27 boys and 4 teachers from St. John's School in Toronto set off on what was meant to be a challenging and transformative canoe trip. It was part of the school's philosophy to push students beyond their limits, to test their endurance and resilience through adversity. Through grueling classes, chores, corporal punishment, and wilderness trips, the boys were taught to endure hardship as part of their growth. They set off on Lake Timiskaming in the early morning. But only a few hours into the journey, the calm waters would soon become treacherous. What started as an exciting adventure-filled trip quickly turned into a desperate fight for survival. Lake Timiskaming isn't a huge lake, but it can be dangerous. It's 73 miles or 117 kilometers long and only about 10 miles or 16 kilometers wide. And the narrow body of water can be deceptive. The lake's high rocky cliffs on both sides create a wind funnel, making it notorious for unpredictable weather. The early voyageurs who traveled this lake quickly learned to respect its fierce temperament. By the 19th century, freight canoes were banned from the lake due to dangerous conditions. When storms hit, waves build up in long open stretches, then ricochet off the cliffs. The waves then bounce back at an odd angle, making navigation difficult. On that June day, one police officer would describe the lake as churning like the sea. The boys and teachers had no idea what they were up against. St. John's School was the brainchild of Ted Byfield and Frank Weens, who were dissatisfied with the public school system. They had this vision to toughen up boys and put them through these rigorous education and these outdoor experiences, toughen them up and make them into men. The school first opened in Manitoba, followed by another in Alberta. The mission was to build character through adversity, to mold boys into self-reliant men who could think for themselves and act on their convictions. But the methods were harsh at this school. Discipline was enforced with corporal punishment, and students were pushed to their limits on wilderness expeditions. From the beginning, there were warning signs. In 1971, a student collapsed and died during a snowshoe race. In 1976, another student, clinically dead for 2 hours after collapsing on a snowshoe trek, was later revived by doctors. On yet another snowshoeing expedition the following year, 16-year-old Stuart Simpson froze both his feet and was told to walk back to camp alone. He was found later with black and purple feet in an unheated cabin. Back in the 70s, parents were a little tougher. Adversity was seen as necessary for growth, and the more the boys were pushed, the stronger they would become. Or so they thought. In 1976, Frank Folletti and Mike Maunder, both alumni of the Manitoba School, started building a school in Ontario. It would follow the same philosophy as the other St. John's schools. And in the school's promotional pamphlets, it highlighted the rewards of this approach. It showed pictures of exhausted but satisfied boys who had embarked on this 800-mile canoe trip. And the message was clear. The boys would have to work hard not only in the classroom, but on expeditions through both winter and summer. And they would even help build the school itself. In December 1976, the part-time school officially opened its doors. And by New Year's Day, the boys went on their first trip, a 24-kilometer or 15-mile trek on snowshoes. And it was brutal. Some of the boys' feet were bleeding, and by the end of the trip, many swore that they wouldn't return. But the school had warned both students and parents that the experience would be grueling, and they were right. Teachers at the school were paid just $1 a day, and finding them was difficult. So the school turned to the UK for recruitment, and they received over 150 applications. And gradually, more and more boys and their parents bought into this idea that adversity was essential to building character. It was a blend of fear, learning, and adventure. For some families, the school's vision was appealing right from the start. 12-year-old David Cunningham was excited about the pictures he saw of dog sleds and snowshoes, wilderness expeditions, and canoe trips, and he immediately begged his mother to let him attend. Joan Mansfield was one of the parents and felt the school could offer discipline for her son Michael, who was becoming a bit unruly at home. Parents were heavily involved in the school, often helping with everything from cooking to driving and even building the school. And they formed really close relationships with the staff. During a 60-kilometer or 37-mile snowshoe race, Joan recalled tending to the boys' feet. She had to apply ointment to their open blisters and wrapped all their feet up. And the boys weren't the only ones tested. It was the teachers, too, who were also exhausted because they went through all of these same rigorous trainings that the boys did. But despite the harshness and brutality of it all, the parents believed in the benefits, and they saw positive changes almost immediately in their sons. The experience wasn't just about survival, it was about learning teamwork and resilience. In 1926, the Balsam Lake tragedy sent shockwaves through Canada. 11 people lost their lives during an Anglican church leadership camp when a canoe capsized just a mile from shore. Following this disaster, summer camps across the country stopped using these large multi-person canoes on open water. But despite that tragedy and the lessons that people learned from it, St. John's continued to organize their ambitious canoe trips in those same large canoes. And they had their own close calls. There were no lives lost, but students recalled several of these trips as disasters from start to finish. One student talked about how they ran out of food, they slept in freezing conditions without proper gear, and struggled against the harsh winter weather. Some of them were actually amazed that nobody died. Ted Byfield, co-founder of the school, believed that risk was an essential part of adventure. He said, "If there's no risk, there's no adventure." St. John's took pride in its grueling outdoor expeditions, and the canoe trip in 1978 would be no different. Leading the trip were Peter Kane, a British Army veteran with limited canoeing experience, and he'd never organized or even led an expedition of this scale before. Neil Thompson was a novice at paddling, and he'd only ever been out on a canoe trip once before. Rounding out the 4 teachers who would be on this trip were Richard Bird and Mark Denny, who both had more paddling experience under their belts than the other 2. The planning itself was hasty. The canoes were brand new and untested. Someone decided that the cane seats were too flimsy, so they cut and bolted plywood on top. This made the boats bulkier and raised the center of gravity, making the boats more unstable. The food boxes that they were taking were so large, there was barely enough room for the boys to sit. And even that morning when they loaded up, Joan Mansfield watched her son Michael and the others and noticed that the canoes looked unusually high and unsteady. But she was reassured by the school's long history of expeditions, and the parents trusted the leaders. Before they set off, neither the boys nor the leaders received any instruction in canoeing, swimming, or basic life-saving techniques. The canoes lacked essential safety equipment like bailers, and no one had been briefed on how to stay warm in cold water in case they capsized. It seemed that no one fully understood the risks of paddling on a northern Ontario lake, especially so soon after spring breakup. The boys would be gone for 3 weeks and would spend long days paddling and retracing the routes of early French explorers. Their destination would be Moosonee, located on James Bay. On Saturday, June 10, 1978, the group set off. After driving through the night, they arrived at Lake Timiskaming boat launch at 7:30 a.m., sleep-deprived but eager. From the start, the canoes felt off. They were higher and tippier and really difficult to handle. Thompson's crew in particular were really nervous. His limited experience didn't inspire much confidence in the boys, but they were reassured by Mike Maunder, who told them that all would be fine as he helped them load up. After all, St. John's had been organizing trips like this since 1962, and no one had died yet. By lunchtime, things seemed to be going pretty well. The group had covered 24 kilometers or 15 miles in 5 hours, aided by a bit of a tailwind. Then they stopped for lunch.
What'd I do for a knife?
Peanut butter and jam sandwiches and granola fueled the boys, but Thompson's canoe was lagging far behind the others. It took them a while to get to the lunch spot. His inexperience with paddle strokes was making it difficult to steer. After lunch, Kane and Bird, leading the stronger crews, decided to race each other to the other side of the lake. Meanwhile, Thompson and Denny's boats struggled to stay on course. By 2 p.m., the wind picked up. The first 2 canoes were nearly across the lake, but the others were struggling. Denny was also starting to have trouble steering. When the boat became parallel to the waves, the boys would stiffen in fear, grab the sides, and would make the canoe rock even more. Thompson was exhausted, and he was starting to sense the growing panic among his crew, and he yelled for them to keep paddling. But fear was starting to take a hold of them. Then without warning, Thompson's canoe flipped. 7 boys and Thompson were thrown into the freezing water. Bird heard some noise and he had turned to see Thompson's canoe, but it had disappeared beneath the waves. It was totally gone. Denny's canoe, just ahead of them, attempted to turn back and help, but in the process, they were hit by waves, swamped, and capsized. There were reports of waves being 4 feet high, but Bird estimated that they were less than 2 feet. Regardless, the waves were enough to swamp 2 of the canoes. Suddenly, 16 people were in the water. Kane and Bird rushed to shore, unloading the boys and the cargo from their canoes, and raced back out to get survivors. The water was so cold it was quickly sapping the boys' strength. Within minutes, they were shivering uncontrollably. Bird and Kane managed to pull up 2 boys each from the water and rush them back to shore before turning back for more kids. But for those still in the water, it was becoming clear that survival would require drastic action. After 40 minutes in the lake, Thompson made the decision to send his boys in pairs towards the shore, but most of them were too weak. One boy, who couldn't even swim, refused to let go of the canoe. Student Scott Binden was rescued and on shore, but he knew that his older brother Dean was in Thompson's canoe and that he was out there somewhere. And he knew the last place that Dean wanted to be was in that canoe with that inexperienced teacher. Kevin Black was on shore, desperately looking for his twin Owen, who was also in Thompson's canoe. Meanwhile, Bird was trying to pull boys into his canoe, but they were panicking and flailing, and then they caused that boat to flip as well. Denny was still in the lake and was becoming totally irrational, so Bird tried to wrestle him into the swamped canoe, but failed. Bird was trying to pull the canoe to shore, and it was encouraging the kids to follow and swim, telling them they only had 20 minutes of consciousness left, but it was almost impossible to move the canoe. He said by then the smallest boy was starting to lose consciousness, and he said himself he was beginning to lose it. Kane's canoe was still upright, and as he was trying to rescue people, Denny tried to climb in, and that caused the last boat to capsize. Fourth canoe was now tipped over, and 21 people were in the water, desperately clinging to the canoes or trying to swim to shore. Thompson found himself suddenly washed up on the shore, unsure of how he made it there. 4 of his crew were dead, floating in the water, and the other 3 were still attached to the canoe. Bird made it to shore, and David Cunningham was so cold that he was becoming delirious. He had taken off most of his clothes because he was trying to suntan, and so all he had was like a Speedo on, so he was freezing. Bird laid on top of him, trying to keep him warm, and covered him with life jackets while he went to look for others. He took some of the boys and they went hiking down the rugged shoreline and found 3 boys floating in a small bay beside Thompson's canoe. Bird jumped in the frigid water immediately, trying to pull them out one by one to safety. He told the boys on shore to give them artificial respiration, and then he'd go back for another boy. But it was too late for all of them. And I'll add here that after the tragedy, Bird said that all students received instruction in artificial respiration. But when they had to put what they had been taught into practice, they weren't prepared. Back in the water, a few boys managed to climb onto one of the canoes after bailing out some water, but the moment one person panicked, they all got thrown back into the water. Ian Harling was one of the boys, and he saw no other option other than to swim for shore. Mike Mansfield decided to do the same and grabbed his friend David Greeney's life jacket, and David grabbed his friend Andy Herman. Mike said he found strength that he didn't know he had, and he swam to shore with all of them attached. But on the way, Andy Herman lost grip. Mike was still hanging on to Greeny though, and he got to shore with him. But by the time he reached shore, Mike passed out right away and woke up later to find Greeny dead beside him. By the end of that day, 12 boys and 1 leader were gone, and for the 18 survivors, life would never be the same. On the Monday, helicopter pilot Gary Smith was flying over Lake Timiskaming when he spotted a large blue canoe with something attached to it. Hovering closer, he saw lifeless bodies still wearing their life jackets tied to the canoe. Unable to land on the rugged shore, Smith quickly diverted to a nearby lodge to call for help, and then returned to the lake. On his way back, he passed more canoes and more bodies floating in the water. Then he discovered the survivors almost by accident. Out of the corner of his eye, he saw a bit of smoke coming up from the trees, and as he got closer, he saw a red tarp tied to a tree. The survivors had spent 24 hours in the rain, cold, and without food, trying to signal rescue. 3 more bodies lay on the shore. When rescuers reached them, the survivors were calm. They said they all walked in like soldiers. There wasn't any crying, one rescuer said. The group had been swarmed by mosquitoes and black flies, yet still no tears, said the rescuers. They said they didn't cry. They had courage. In hindsight, they were more likely in shock, not courageous. They were struggling with the trauma of what they just witnessed and went through. Even the rescue was dangerous. When police went out to recover the bodies in the rough water, their boat flipped over too. Eventually, the survivors were brought to the lodge and they were warmed up and fed. In the days following the tragedy, John Smithson, a spokesperson for St. John's, won the award for the most insensitive post-tragedy comment. He said, "The school goes on. It's not the end of the world. We just keep plugging away." Can't imagine how the parents felt about that. He even suggested the trip might resume, arguing, "We've never canceled a trip yet." But not surprisingly, the trip did not resume. And questions immediately arose after the tragedy. Were 4 adults enough to supervise 27 students? Were the canoes safe enough to hold 8 people, along with gear and food for 3 weeks? And why would anyone challenge a lake so unpredictable, especially when locals avoided it in rough weather? And most critically, did the leaders know about the severe weather advisory that had just been issued hours before they set out? Co-founder Ted Byfield expressed his own regrets. He said, "You're always haunted by the dread that something is going to happen, then whack. You take all the safety precautions you can take, and then some, but it's always luck or the grace of God that saves you." Byfield said that this was the first incident in over 100 expeditions. He had paddled Lake Timiskaming a decade earlier with a group of boys, but under much calmer conditions. Still, he insisted the tragedy was an unavoidable accident, not a failure in planning or preparation. And there was a coroner's inquest, and it would largely echo his statement, ruling the incident as an unfortunate accident. But in the coroner's report released 2 weeks later, it painted a way more critical picture. It highlighted several alarming failures: lack of preparation, no radios, lack of local knowledge, no swimming or paddling practice, staff learning on the job, no chain of command, no emergency procedures, no paddling practice, and starting out on the trip when they were all exhausted that morning. According to the Toronto Star, weather warnings had been issued early Sunday, forecasting severe thunderstorms between 1 and 2 p.m. with winds reaching 60 kilometers or 40 miles an hour. Experienced canoeists like Emmy Dorval later spoke out, saying the group was on the worst part of the lake when the storm hit. He said the wind was blowing like hell that day. No one should have been on the lake. He said the group could have taken refuge in small creeks nearby if they had been familiar with the area. And another local, Bob Guerra, who helped evacuate survivors, said, "I wouldn't have gone out there that day. You need a big boat to handle those waves." He said many local canoeists have learned caution and normally avoid the lake altogether. Neil Thompson survived but was emotionally shattered. He had lost his entire crew. After the tragedy, he visited the families of the boys who had died, and he was the only one to visit some of the families. One parent mentioned how much that meant to them, for him to come and grieve with them. Surprisingly, the parents publicly supported the school despite the horrific tragedy. They had invested so much in the school, they helped build it, they worked really close with the staff, and they shared that philosophy. Andy Herman's parents voiced their frustration with media reports that suggested the school pushed the boys too hard. They said the teachers were not bullies, they were kind people. He said the school had discipline, but it was discipline that was done with love and care and kindness. While one family considered legal action, they eventually decided not to sue. The school continued to operate for another 11 years before closing in 1989. The Manitoba school shut its doors a year later. But the scars from the tragedy were lasting. Many families were torn apart in the aftermath. Several of them divorced, and many survivors struggled with the guilt and trauma. Some blamed themselves for not asking more questions before the trip. Richard Bird, reflecting on the tragedy days later, appeared grief-stricken at a press conference. "I haven't searched my soul completely," he said, but added, "It was a chain of unfortunate events that somehow got out of control." Looking back, he regretted not considering the steep shorelines and rough terrain that had made rescue almost impossible. Despite the warnings from locals, Bird maintained that weather conditions were not a significant hazard. He said, "As far as I'm concerned, there was nothing in the weather that should have posed a hazard to our canoes. The waves were 18 inches high at most." But reports from lodge workers and other lakeside residents say otherwise, claiming waves were 4 feet with white caps on the water that day. The Lake Timiskaming tragedy remains a stark reminder of the delicate balance between adventure and risk. Events of that day raised difficult questions about where the line should be drawn. How much risk is too much when young lives are at stake? And the tragedy exposed the glaring need for greater caution, better preparation, and respect for the unpredictable power of nature when sending students out into the wilderness. There's a fine line between adventure and peril. David Greeny's parents quietly asked for that canoe that their son paddled on the last day of his life. For 27 years, it sat in their garage, which was a reminder of his loss. Eventually, they donated the canoe to the Canadian Canoe Museum in Peterborough, Ontario. They wanted it to be used for educational purposes. This is a great learning lesson. If you're ever going to send your kid out on a wilderness adventure like these, make sure you ask a lot of questions beforehand.